Chapter 116, The Game of Faith. Neil heard Kai's question about Mia Harrison, but instead of answering, he chose to pretend he didn't hear it and began to quickly speak about their plan. You know what to do, Kai. Don't deviate from the plan and don't, for your sake, change your story. If you play it exactly the way I told you, you'll come off like a hero instead of an accomplice. Knowing Neil so well, Kai didn't push the topic. Not to mention, this wasn't the right time to speak about anything else but his escape. Like a hero, I understand. He nodded his head with a grin. But something about Kai's lazy grin and preoccupied, restless stance alarmed Neil. For some reason, he felt like the boy was making up his own plans in his head. But to make certain, he clearly and seriously repeated the plan that they had only been able to whisper about before now in their cell room. Kai, just do it the way we decided. Leave the soldier's shopping list on the floor of the car. Do your errands for an hour, then tell the securities in the store that you left your list in the car and can't be sure if you've got everything. Tell them you have to get it, and come back here. The car will be locked. As he spoke, Neil took the list from Kai's hand and tossed it on the floor of the passenger side. Then he closed and locked the door. With an inner calm he didn't feel, he took Kai's arm and propelled him firmly toward the corner. Neil knew that the soldiers could see his movement, so he didn't pull Kai far away from the building Jason had entered. He continued to speak under his breath, when you get to the car and discover the door is locked, go across the street to the grocery store. Look around for some time, then ask the securities if they've seen anyone who looks like me. Give them my description. When they tell you they haven't, go to all the stores around the streets and ask if they've seen me. When they tell you no, head straight into the building Jason entered and start opening doors, asking where the bastard, Jason, is. Tell everyone you need to report a possible escape. The securities in all the stores you went to earlier will verify your whole story, and since you're going to alert Jason that I'm missing before he would have come out here and discovered it himself, he'll be convinced you're as innocent as a baby. Do you copy all that? Why do I feel like a soldier on a mission? I like the feeling though, you know, the feeling of doing something exciting. You see, Kai began to ramble on, but when he met Neil's no-nonsense gray eyes, he grinned and gave him a cheerful thumbs up. I copy everything you've said, Brother Neil. Stop fretting about me and go before Wallace returns. Neil nodded, turned to begin walking, but then halted and glanced back. When he noticed the bitter smile on Kai's face, he felt a pang in his chest. He had never grown attached to someone as quickly as he had to this boy. However, with the realization that they would cross paths again someday, he relaxed a bit. Kai. He spoke earnestly. Yeah, Brother Neil? Kai replied, blinking repeatedly as if holding back tears. Be careful. It was an unusual thing for Neil to show any form of concern for another person. However, he revealed a slight smile, realizing the little time he'd spent in the military prison had built something unknown within him. He observed the boy's attempt to conceal his emotions. You too, but it's not a goodbye. I'll find you once I leave this place. And I'll assist you in clearing your name. Neil smiled at that. Yes, we'll meet again. But only if you behave. No more harassing women or issuing death threats to people, he asserted in a brotherly tone. Then, after one last look, he added, take care of yourself, and swiftly walked away, leaving Kai gazing at his departing figure with tear-filled eyes. Neil, on the other hand, walked out of the corner. The restaurant he had been ordered to get chicken soup from was on the corner with two entrance doors, one on the street facing the building Jason was in, and another one facing a side street. Forcing himself not to deviate from his plan, Neil walked into the main entrance of the restaurant. In case the soldiers were sitting before their computers and monitoring his movement, which he knew they occasionally did, he lingered just inside the doors without going inside, unnoticed, and counted slowly to 30. 10 minutes later, he was several blocks away from the restaurant, his prison jacket tucked under his arm, walking swiftly toward his first destination just like in his escape plan. The cold was biting at his skin, but he ignored it and walked into an isolated corner of the street with his head bowed down. His heart was beating loudly with suspense and dread. He crossed another street on a red light, dashing between two cars that had slowed to make a right turn. Then he saw what he was looking for. Parked on the right side of the road was a gray car, with the same plate number as the one given to him by Liam the last time they had met. He breathed a sigh of relief at the sight of the car. He hadn't expected to find it there as Liam had warned him that it had been there for a week. With his head bent and his hands in his pockets, he slowed his pace to normal. The snow was beginning to fall in earnest as he strode past the car, heading directly towards a small building across the street. He grasped the doorknob and twisted it open. He walked inside the building, which happened to be a public restroom that was under construction, and carefully locked the door behind him. All his attention turned on the overflowing workers' equipment inside the building. He had to get rid of the tracker like he was taught. And everything he needed to do so was supposed to be in here among the workers' equipment. If anyone had taken the things meant for him out, then his luck had just run out. Neil began to grab random bags and empty them on the ground. Soon he found what he was looking for. He took out a screwdriver and other things he needed and sat on the ground. He cut off the strap of the monitor around his ankle, knowing that it would give off a signal. He tied it around something else. When he was done with the monitor, Neil rolled up his shirt sleeve, revealing his inked arm where the tracker had been inserted. Taking a deep breath, he used the screwdriver and dug out the tracker from his arm. Immediately, blood began to ooze out, but he ignored it, knowing if he wasn't fast enough, the soldiers and authorities would soon come after him. Neil stood up and yanked open the other bag with one hand and started unbuttoning his prison shirt with his other. Inside the bag was a pair of black trousers in his size, and a big black sweater, with a long overcoat, shoes in his size. Then lastly, he took out a face mask and a pair of black sunglasses. When he was done wearing everything, he took out some papers from another bag and saw that one of the papers contained the detailed instructions to his destination, which happened to be one of his properties up on a mountain far away from the cities in life. He had gotten it years ago under a fake identity, which not everybody knew about. The safe direction he would drive to avoid checkpoints was written on the paper. He wasn't that familiar with Novaria, thus he would be needing the paper to guide him out of the city. Neil took out the keys of the gray car parked outside from the bag and put it inside his pocket. Then he also saw a thick white envelope inside it. He found bundles of dollar bills. Then he pulled out the last thing inside the bag, which happened to be a gun with a bullet package. Neil was taken aback by the gun. Initially considering keeping it to avoid further trouble, he ultimately changed his mind. It was clear that Kai's brother believed the well-dressed escaped convict should have a weapon. Mentally counting the seconds, Neil donned the black coat over his new attire, stashed the old clothes in a bag, and tidied up the scattered items on the ground. He aimed to disappear without a trace, leaving no clues behind. When he was done, Neil opened another envelope containing papers for his new identity and a passport under the name Roman Fernandez. The second envelope held prepaid airline tickets to various cities, some in the name of Roman Fernandez and others under different aliases to use in case his current identity was compromised. Neil knew appearing at an airport was risky and needed to be avoided until the situation cooled down. He placed his faith in a plan he had orchestrated from his prison cell, with the assistance of Kai's brother's associates. They had arranged for a decoy to divert attention away from Neil, waiting for his signal in a hotel. All Neil had to do was call the decoy and signal him. If the soldiers were misled by the plan and pursued the wrong target, Neil would have some time alone. When the time was right, he planned to confront his enemies one by one to prove his innocence and avenge his parents' deaths. He would never accept defeat before achieving his biggest goal in life. Mia, who had left her hotel early without staying to have her breakfast, felt her stomach begin to growl. Knowing she had a long way to drive before arriving at her destination, she decided to stop at a small restaurant at the side of the road and eat something quickly. She parked her red BMW 7 at the small parking area in front of the restaurant where there was another car beside hers. She pulled on her cap and wore her thick gloves before stepping out of the warmth of her car into the biting cold outside that made her shiver immediately. "Gosh, the cold here is killing," she muttered to herself as she hurried inside the glass-walled small restaurant. Apart from the fact that she was hurrying back home because of rain, she had also made an appointment with her therapist to meet this evening. Even though 5 years had passed, she was still struggling with her strange nightmares and hallucinating about things that weren't real. Things like seeing two of herself and dreaming about a certain someone she had sworn to never speak his name again with her mouth. Neil Weiner was like a taboo to her and society now. She wanted to forget about him and everything she ever liked about him. She wanted to live a life without ever remembering how he had made her feel, and how he'd been the first and only man to make her heart skip a beat and made her feel excited at the mere mention of his name in the past. Mia ordered her food in the restaurant and took a seat beside a young woman who was cuddling a toddler to her chest next to the glass wall. She sat down and offered the woman a smile while blocking all thoughts of Neil from her mind to focus only on her bright future. unknown to her that fate wasn't done playing its game on them. Chapter 117. The Hunt for the Escaped Convict. Back within the room, Neil had finished dressing up. After putting on his face mask and sunglasses, he prepared to make his exit. Though he had some doubt in his mind if his plans of diversion would work for long, or if he'd ever reach his first destination before he was killed. But none of that mattered right now. At the moment, all that mattered was that he was temporarily free and that he was practically on his way to cross Novaria's border, a 90-mile journey to the north. If he made it that far without being apprehended, he might be able to make it to his next destination, a distance of only 45 miles. Then, somewhere high in the mountains, was his first destination, a secluded mansion deep in the woods that he had long ago bought and had forgotten about its existence until now. He would use it as a hideout for a while. Between now and then, all he had to worry about was crossing the borders of 2 states, getting to the safety of that mansion without being noticed by anyone. And once he got there, he would control his impatience and wait until the initial furor over his escape died down so that he could embark on the second stage of his plan. Neil picked up the gun, rammed a full clip into it, checked the safety, and put the gun in his coat pocket along with a fistful of dollar bills. Then he grabbed the backpack and car keys and opened the door. He was going to make it, he assured himself as he stepped into the cold. He walked around the corner of the building, heading toward the gray car that had been kept for him. However, he stopped dead in his tracks, momentarily unable to believe his eyes. The car he had been happy to see a moment ago was now being pulled away by a tow truck. Neil stood there, immobilized, watching it being pulled away through the road. Behind him, he heard someone shout to the other, "I told you that the car had been abandoned. It's been parked there for days. It has no owner. We should have taken it the other day, now see." Their voices snapped Neil's brain out of its temporary paralysis. He could either go back into the building, change into his prison clothes, leave everything behind, and try to reschedule everything for another time, or he could improvise now. The choice was really no choice at all. He wasn't going back to prison. He would rather be dead than be back in that place. Neil made up his mind and did the only thing he could think of. He dashed toward the corner, looking for the only other sure means of getting out of Novaria before the military would come after him. He flagged down a bus and climbed aboard. Despite wearing a face mask and sunglasses, he made sure to avoid people's eyes by turning his face towards the bus window. Almost everyone in the country knew who he was after the court case that took place 5 years ago. His face was recognized all over the world. He couldn't risk showing it to anyone. For 20 agonizingly slow minutes, the bus moved through the heavy traffic of Novaria, making stops at nearly every corner. When the bus made another annoying stop at a junction, Neil had no choice. He angrily climbed down via the rear doors and began walking toward the intersection a mile ahead where he knew would lead to the main highway that would take him out of Novaria. Hitchhiking a ride was his only option, and that option would only be good for a maximum of minutes. Once Jason or the soldiers realized he was gone, every authority and military personnel in Novaria would be looking for him and focusing their attention on any hitchhiker on the road. Neil stood by the roadside and raised his thumb to hitchhike a ride. Snow clung to his hair and swirled around his feet as he bent his head into the wind. Several cars roared past him, the drivers ignoring his upraised thumb, and he fought down a panicky feeling of impending doom that rose to his stomach. Traffic in Novaria was heavy on the highway because of the snow, but everybody was evidently in a hurry to reach their destinations before the snowstorm struck, and they weren't stopping for anything or anyone. Neil resumed walking down the roads. Up ahead at the intersection was a small, modern restaurant that was built with glass walls, with 2 cars in the small parking lot, a red BMW 7 and a white family bus. Carrying his backpack, he walked up the parking lot, and when he passed the restaurant, he glanced carefully through the glass walls at the occupants. There was a lone woman, whose face he couldn't see because her back was turned to the wall, and sitting next to her was another woman holding a baby in hand. He cursed under his breath because both cars belonged to women, and they weren't likely to pick up hitchhikers from the look of how rich they seemed. Without slowing his pace, Neil continued toward the end of the restaurant where the 2 cars were parked, wondering if the keys were in the ignitions. Even if they were, he knew it was insanity to steal one of those cars because he would have to drive it right past the restaurant in order to get out of the parking lot. If he did that, whoever owned the car would have the authorities come after him sooner than the military, and he would be caught before he even made it out of the state. What's more, from inside the building, they could see which way he drove. Maybe he could try to bribe one of the women in the restaurant to give him a ride when she came out. However, judging from the expensive cars, they didn't seem like people who lacked money. But then, if his money didn't persuade her to agree, he had a gun that could convince her. Damn it, there had to be a better way to get out of here than to threaten one of the women. In front of him, cars roared down the road, making mini blizzards with their wheels and causing the snow to fly around and cloud the air. Neil dusted the snow off his hair and glanced at his watch. Nearly an hour had passed since he had left Kai. He didn't dare try hitchhiking anymore. If Kai had followed his instructions, Jason would be sounding an alert to the military in no time. And as if his thoughts had caused it to happen, the authority cars suddenly appeared from the distance and slowed down in front of the restaurant, then turned into the parking lot a few feet away from Neil's hiding spot, coming toward him. Instinctively, Neil crouched down, pretending that he was inspecting the tire on the red BMW 7, and then an idea suddenly struck his head as the tire came into his view. Too late perhaps, but he would give it a try. Neil quickly took out a switchblade from his backpack and struck it into the side of the car's tire. Then he ducked to one side to avoid the explosion of air. From the corner of his eye, he watched the authority car glide to a stop behind him. Instead of demanding to know what Neil was doing loitering around the restaurant with a backpack, the police rolled down his car window and drew the obvious conclusion. "Sir, you seem to be having trouble with that tire." "Yeah, I am," Neil agreed, slapping the side of the tire, careful not to look over his shoulder despite the face mask he had on. Hearing the policeman open his car door, Neil's breath caught short in his lungs. But he didn't let it show and continued to say, "My wife tried to warn me about the tire but I didn't listen, and now I'm having this trouble." "Let me see if I can." The policeman began to approach while speaking, but he stopped dead in his tracks as his radio beeped in his pocket. Then, without paying any more attention to Neil, he turned back and rushed to his car and roared out of the parking lot with its siren wailing. A moment later, Neil heard more sirens coming from every direction, and then he saw the authorities' cars racing across the roads, their warning lights revolving. The authorities, Neil knew, were now aware that an escaped convict was on the loose. The hunt for him had begun even before he left Novaria. Chapter 118. Take her with him. Inside the restaurant, Mia finished her meal and a hot coffee and fished inside her purse for money to pay the check. She had eaten enough and was warm enough to head back on her journey. With such terrible weather, she couldn't delay it any more than she had, especially when she was traveling alone. Mia glanced at her wristwatch and saw that it was almost 12 in the afternoon. She quickly picked up her purse and smiled at the mother, who had been trying to have a casual conversation with her the whole time they were eating at the adjoining table, and walked up to the cash register to pay her bill. As she emerged from the building, looking down at her phone, she stopped in surprise as a police car suddenly made a frantic U-turn in front of her, and turned on its siren, then shot out of the parking lot onto the road. Distracted by that, she failed to notice the dark-haired man crouching next to the back wheel of her car on the driver's side. It wasn't until she nearly tripped over him and struggled to maintain her balance that she was aware of his presence. Swiftly, the man rose to his feet and encircled her waist with a firm arm, preventing her from falling forward. Mia's eyes had instinctively shut in anticipation of a fall, but upon feeling his arm secure her and draw her close, she slowly opened them. At first, she didn't move. She gazed up at his concealed face, sensing his grip tighten around her. Even though his features were masked, a surge of emotions she hadn't felt in years stirred within her, jolting her back to reality as she pushed herself away. He towered over her from a height of about 6'3", and she took a startled, cautious step backward, her voice shaky with alarm and suspicion as she saw how he didn't move away from his spot and was looking down at her through his black sunglasses. "What were you doing there?" she demanded, frowning at her own image as it was reflected back at her from the shiny lenses of his sunglasses. Neil, who couldn't believe his eyes, didn't reply and continued to look at the woman before him. Never in a million years did he expect to find her here or ever see her again. But standing before him was none other than the woman he had struggled hard to forget about during his first years in prison. For years, she had haunted his dreams and made him burn to have her wrapped around his arm like he did the night she lay curled up in his arms 5 years ago. Every time Liam paid him a visit, he would itch to know how she was doing, but then he would hold himself back at the thought that it was pointless asking about someone he would never meet or touch again. Through all these years, he had heard news about her on television, but he had acted indifferent to everything as he wanted to wipe her out of his mind and life. But here she was, looking different from the girl he'd admired in Ivy Grove. She looked all mature and more beautiful. "I asked you a question, sir. What were you doing crouching down there?" She repeated herself, her voice laced with annoyance for his lack of reply. Neil snapped back to his senses, burying the emotions that had stirred within him at the sight of her. He actually managed to smile behind his mask because his mind had finally started working, and he now knew exactly how he was going to get her to offer him a ride and take him to his destination. Taking on different identities and pretending to be someone he wasn't was one of the things he was good at when he was a soldier. Thus, he would put that to use. Neil thought as he cleared his throat to utilize the voice-altering technique he'd mastered in the military. Nodding toward her rear tire, which was very obviously flat, he spoke with a voice that sounded nothing like his normal voice. "I was planning to change your tire for you if you don't mind. I was waiting right there when I noticed it was flat, so I crouched down to take a look at it." He lied. Mia frowned at his words. Her tire had been fine when she stopped here. And why would someone like him be kind enough to change her tire when he didn't even know her? She thought as she glanced towards the flat tire. Seeing how flat it looked, she glanced back at the man and said, "I'm sorry for being so rude, but you startled me. I wasn't looking my way and I almost fell. Sorry about that. I came here with my police friend when I saw your tire." Neil improvised smoothly, deliberately making it sound as if the policeman who had stopped by earlier was a friend of his. "He got another call and had to leave. Do you have the tools so I can change the tire for you?" Mia, who had noticed the police car earlier, felt her fears completely vanish at the thought that he was friends with a policeman, and she smiled kindly at the stranger. "This is very kind of you," she said, opening the trunk of her BMW to look for the tools, but because she wasn't exactly sure what tool he would need, she stood there tapping her chin. I'm not sure what you need here," she murmured, and immediately she felt the man walk up to her from behind. He didn't even touch her, but yet her heart skipped a beat and she quickly moved away to give him access to take what he needed. Neil noticed how she moved to the side and hugged her midriff, but he didn't think much of her action. He leaned down and took the things he needed from the trunk. He didn't fail to notice the cameras and mic and other things in her trunk. She must be coming back from her work, he thought to himself. "This will only take a few minutes," he assured her. He was also in a hurry, but no longer fighting down panic. Mia already thought he was friendly with the policeman, so she had naturally thought he was trustworthy. And after he changed her tire, she'd owe him a ride. Once they were on the road, the authorities wouldn't give them a second glance because they would be looking for a man who was traveling alone. For now, if anyone noticed him, he would appear to be an ordinary husband changing a tire while his wife looked on. "Where are you heading?" he asked her, while taking off his gloves. I am heading to the south, I mean to Mirage Mesa," Mia said, admiring the man's easy skill with the heavy vehicle. He had an unusually nice voice, uncommonly deep and smooth. His hair was dark and very thick, but poorly cut, and she wondered idly what he looked like without the concealing barrier of those reflective sunglasses and face mask. Very handsome, she decided, but it wasn't his good looks that kept drawing her eyes back to his concealed profile. It was something else, something about him seemed very familiar to her, but she couldn't pinpoint what. Mia shrugged the feeling off, and cradled the purse in her hand. She didn't know why, but she wanted to hear him speak again, and so she decided to have a polite conversation. "Do you live around here?" she asked curiously. "Not anymore. I am traveling to another state to start a new job tomorrow, but I have to be there by tomorrow morning or they'll give it to someone else." He finished jacking the car up and began loosening the bolts on the tire. Then he nodded toward the backpack that Mia hadn't seen before because it had somehow gotten shoved under her car. "A friend of mine was supposed to pick me up here 3 hours ago and give me a ride part of the way," he lied, "but I guess something happened and he isn't going to make it." "You've been waiting out here for 3 hours?" Mia exclaimed. "You must be freezing cold." She looked at him with pity as she couldn't imagine herself being out here in the cold for an hour, not to mention 3 hours. Though the man didn't look like a poor person judging from his attire, she still felt a sense of pity for him. He kept his face averted, apparently concentrating on his task of changing her tire, and Mia restrained the strong urge to try to bend down and get a longer, closer look at his face. She felt a little ache in her heart as she noticed the snow clutching to his hair. "Would you like a cup of hot coffee?" she found herself asking. He nodded his head. "I'd like that." Mia decided to head back into the restaurant to buy him something hot, but before she left, she turned over her shoulder to ask, "How do you like your coffee?" Black, Neil said, fighting to keep his frustration in check. Mia was heading south from Novaria, whereas his destination was north. Though he couldn't help but wonder if she now lived in Mirage Mesa or was just going there to spend her holidays, he didn't let his damn curiosity wander and instead focused on the task at hand. Neil stole a glance at his watch and began working even faster. Nearly an hour and a half had passed since he walked away from Kai, and his risk of capture was increasing every moment he stayed around Novaria. Regardless of which way she was going, he had to go with her. Putting some miles between himself and Novaria was all that mattered now. He could ride with her for some hours and double back via a different route later, or even force her to take him to his destination and keep her with him there until everything settles. Chapter 119. Are you married? The waitress at the restaurant needed to brew another pot of coffee, and by the time Mia returned to her car with the steaming to-go coffee cup, the man had nearly finished changing the tire. Snow was already 2 inches deep on the ground and the biting wind was gathering force, whipping the sides of her coat open and making her eyes water. She saw him rub his bare hands together and thought of the new job he said was waiting for him tomorrow. She knew jobs these days were scarce, and based on his lack of a car, he was probably badly in need of money. His trousers were new, she realized, noticing for the first time the telltale vertical crease down the front of the legs when he stood up. He had probably bought new expensive clothes in order to make a good impression on his future employer, she mused, and the thought of him doing that sent sympathy pouring through her. When she first graduated from the university, Mia remembered doing something like that. She had bought new expensive clothes in order to make a good impression in the agency, and it had cost her all the money in her bank account then. She knew the feeling of being desperate for a job. Mia had never before offered a hitchhiker a ride. The risks were far too high. But she decided to do it this time, not only because he had changed her tire or because he seemed nice, but also because she had the strong urge in her heart to help him and see that he got his job. He must have spent a fortune on those clothes alone. The poor thing wanted to give a good impression. New thick coat, stiff and spotless, obviously purchased by a jobless man who was pinning all his hopes on a brighter future that wasn't going to materialize unless someone gave him a ride at least partway to his destination so he could start to work. And she would be that someone. Mia decided with a small smile as she approached him. "Wow, you finished it sooner than I expected," Mia said, walking up to him. She held the cup of coffee out to him and he took it with both hands that were red from the cold. There was an aloofness about him that made her hesitate to offer him money, but on the second chance he would seem to prefer the ride, thus she offered anyway. "I'd like to pay you for changing the tire," she began, and when he curtly shook his head, she added, "In that case, can I give you a ride?" "The ride would be fine," Neil said, accepting her offer with a brief smile as he quickly reached down and pulled his backpack out from under the car. "I'm heading south, too." He lied again. It seemed he would have to keep lying to her all the way until he had reached his destination. Even though he wanted to scold her of how easy it was to make her trust a stranger she knew nothing about, Neil held himself back as to not give himself away. When they got into the car, he introduced himself to her as Roman Fernandez. And Mia introduced herself as Mia Harrison, but to make certain he realized she was just offering him a ride and nothing more, she carefully addressed him the next time she spoke as Mr. Fernandez. He picked up her cue and thereafter called her Miss Harrison. Mia relaxed completely after that. The formality of Miss Harrison was completely reassuring, and so was his immediate acceptance of their situation. She didn't want him to get the wrong impression that she had any other reasons for offering him a ride. After what happened to her 5 years ago, she had grown wary of men she didn't know anything about, but today she had found herself unable to leave this one behind after helping her with her tire. Though his height and aura reminded her of the man she wanted so badly to forget, she knew he couldn't be the one. And because she had hated a certain gray-eyed man for killing her mother, it didn't mean she would hate every man who was as tall as he was. The silence in the car suddenly became awkward and the man beside her remained absolutely silent and distant. Mia began to wish she hadn't insisted on formality. She knew she wasn't good at hiding her thoughts, therefore he had probably realized at once that she was putting him in his place, a needless insult, considering that he had shown her only gallant kindness by changing her tire without even knowing who she was. However, Mia didn't start a conversation, deciding it to be the best decision. Meanwhile, Neil, on the other hand, was too busy with his thoughts to think of the awkwardness in the car. They had been on the road for a full 20 minutes before he felt the strangling tension in his chest begin to dissolve, and he drew a long, full breath, his first easy breath in hours. No, months. Years. Helplessness had raged in him for so long that he felt almost lightheaded without the feeling. He was finally able to relax and focus on the woman beside him, but just as he was about to turn to her, a black car roared past them. It cut across their lane to exit the highway, but it lost traction and spun around, missing Mia's car by inches. But only because the young woman beside him handled her vehicle with surprising skill, causing him to look on in shocked amusement. Unfortunately, she also drove too damned fast, with the daredevil aggressiveness and fearless disregard of danger that was completely unlike the girl he knew before. In the past, whenever he drove fast with her in his car, she would look like a frightened rabbit, but now, she even had a smile on her face like a little maniac. Neil suddenly wished there was some way he could suggest she let him drive instead, but she said in a quietly amused voice, "You can relax now, Mr. Fernandez, I've slowed down." "I didn't mean to scare you like that." "I wasn't scared," he said with unintentional coldness. Mia glanced sideways at him and smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "You're holding onto the sides of your seat with both hands. That's usually a dead giveaway." "I'm good with the wheels, worry not," she assured confidently. Once upon a time she used to be scared of speeding cars, now it was the only thing that took her mind off her worries and burden. Two things struck Neil at once. This woman beside him wasn't the Mia Harrison he used to know. And being around the opposite sex had become completely awkward and alien to him. He also realized, the moment he turned to gaze at her, that she still had her breathtaking smile. The dent on her cheeks was so prominent he felt the urge to dip a finger into it. Her smile glowed in her eyes and lit up her entire face, transforming what was merely a pretty face into one that was captivating. She had changed her hairstyle from how it used to look in the past. She now had a well-cut fringe that covered her forehead. Since wondering about her was infinitely preferable to worrying about things he couldn't yet control, Neil concentrated on her with all of his attention. She wore no makeup except for a little lipstick, and there was a freshness about her, a simplicity in the way she styled her thick, shiny brown hair, all of which had made her look younger, like someone in her early 20s. As he continued to gaze at her, Neil suddenly remembered something Kai had mentioned about her getting married. He looked down at her ring finger and noticed a beautiful diamond ring sitting perfectly on it. "Are you married?" he asked bluntly, then winced at the brusque tactlessness of the question. Obviously, if they didn't catch him and send him back to prison, he was going to have to relearn some things in his old characteristics. Neil thought as he waited for her reaction to his blunt question. But instead of being irritated by the question, she flashed him another one of those mesmerizing smiles of hers and said in a voice laced with amusement, "Well, not yet, but almost. I mean, I'm engaged." She raised her hand to show him her engagement ring. "To who?" Neil heard himself blurt, then he closed his eyes in disbelief at his sudden anger. He was soon going to give himself away if he wasn't careful. Thus, he quickly amended his words when he saw her glance at him with a frown. "I was surprised to hear that you were engaged," he explained. "You don't look old enough to get married." He said with an indifferent tone, but because of his concealed face, she couldn't see through his mask. She seemed to sense his change in demeanor, because she laughed awkwardly and said, "I'm 26. I'm old enough for that." For some reason, Neil suddenly felt like a blow had been sent to his gut. A sense of betrayal suddenly consumed him. It surged through him until he could barely breathe and clenched his fist to control himself. Why was he angry at the fact that she was marrying another man? She wasn't his then, and she would never be now. Fate had already decided their paths since they were still little. They had been separated then, and they had been now. She had never been his to keep even though she had been the girl he loved as a boy. Life changes, people change. But why was he finding it hard to accept the fact that she was getting married to someone else? Neil was puzzling over that when she suddenly asked what he did for a living, and he answered with the first occupation that seemed to suit what he'd already told her about himself. "I'm applying for a job as an assistant director of a real estate development firm." "Really? My fiancé is also into that field. He is the CEO of a real estate company in Mirage Mesa. You must have heard about him in the news. He's one of the top businessmen in the country, Owen Sullivan. If you want, I can put in some words for you to get an opportunity." "No," he cut her off coldly at the mere mention of the man she was getting married to. So she was finally marrying her childhood sweetheart? Owen Sullivan, Neil thought with a deep resentment towards the man. How did he even climb to the top of the business chain when he had been just a nobody 5 years ago? Ironically, he was now the wanted criminal while the other was now one of the richest men in the world. Neil thought bitterly, but then when he noticed his earlier rejection had affected the young woman beside him, he cleared his throat and amended, I don't want to work in Mirage Mesa as I have no place to stay. You have helped me enough with the ride. Mia took her eyes from the road, which alarmed him because he didn't trust her daredevil driving, and she regarded him intently, which also alarmed him even more. If you are qualified for the job, you will get a place to stay. Think about it, she probed. Mia didn't know why she was insisting on helping him. But Owen had also started from a very small position before he reached the position he was now. He had explained to her how a kind man had helped him years ago and gave him a job. She knew if she were to introduce this man to him, he would help him with a position in his company. I'm not interested in working in Mirage Mesa, Neil stated flatly, making it clear he wasn't interested in continuing that conversation with her. He would rather be dead than work under that bastard, which he wasn't even in need of the job. All right, Mia replied and concentrated on the road. He was a very unusual man. She couldn't decide whether she liked his company in her car or not. And she couldn't get over the uneasy feeling that he reminded her of someone. She wished she could see his face without those sunglasses and face mask. Chapter 120. Neil Wayner. The city of Novaria soon vanished in the rearview mirror of Mia's car, and the sky turned the heavy, ominous gray of an early dusk with heavy snow falling from the sky. Silence hung in the car, and fat snow smacked her windshield, slowly gaining an edge on the car's windshield wipers. They had been on the road for hours when Neil glanced in the outside rearview mirror on his side, and his blood immediately froze. A half-mile behind them, and closing fast, was the authority car with its red and blue lights rotating furiously. A second later, he heard the siren begin to wail in the atmosphere, and he felt panic slowly begin to seep into his bones. He hated this feeling, but he had no choice. The woman beside him heard it, too. She glanced in the rearview mirror and took her foot off of the gas pedal, slowing the car and angling it onto the side. Neil reached into his jacket pocket, his hand closing on the butt of his gun, although he had no idea at that moment exactly what he meant to do with it if the police tried to pull them over. The police car was so close now, he could see there was not one, but two policemen in the front seat. They pulled around the BMW, and kept going without stopping them or looking their way. There must be some accident up ahead, Mia murmured as she drove up a hill and came to a stop as she noticed what looked like a 6-mile traffic jam on the snowy highway. A moment later, two ambulances came roaring past them. Neil's rush of adrenaline subsided, leaving him shaken and limp. He felt as if he had suddenly exceeded his capacity to react with violent emotion to anything whatsoever, which was probably due to him having been trying to execute for days a carefully thought-out escape plan that should have been a guaranteed success if it weren't for his car that was pulled away by those trucks. Everything else that had gone wrong was a result of that. He wasn't sure even now if his decoy was still waiting for his call before he would distract the military. To be safe, Liam hadn't thought he needed a cell phone to avoid being tracked down. And now he would need to find a phone booth, which was rare unless he got lucky and came across one of the ones stationed at the roadside for travelers to make his call. However, until Mia had driven further away from Novaria, he didn't dare stop to find a phone booth. Moreover, although his destination was only 130 miles from Novaria's border, he needed to be traveling northwest to get there. Instead, he was now heading southeast with Mia because he couldn't let her know who he was. Mia, who was watching the traffic jam ahead of them, heard her phone ringing. She fished it out of her purse and looked down at the caller. Seeing it was Owen, she sighed and put the phone on silent mode before dropping it back inside the purse, deciding to call him back later when she entered Mirage Mesa. She knew he must be calling to know where she was at the moment. Though Mia knew he was calling because he worried about her, she sometimes felt as if he treated her like a little child. Even though she made it appear to strangers that she loved the man she was going to be marrying soon, deep down, she knew she was kidding herself. She had lost the ability to feel all the exciting emotions of love the day she found her mother laying on the floor of her room with a hole in her chest, and the day the man she loved was proven guilty of murdering her. She was at her lowest point in life when Owen appeared like an angel in disguise. He had helped her with the burial ceremony of her mother when all the people in Whispering Way blamed her for the death of her beloved mother. Though she had been angry at Owen before then, She had forgiven him when she saw how hard he tried to make her smile again after her mother's death. Back then, she would ignore him for days, and he would come over to her dorm and refuse to go until she would come out to speak to him. There was a day he stood in the rain for an entire night because she refused to step out and see him. The next day when Mia found him curled up outside and shivering, she had felt like a monster for ignoring the man who had done nothing but help her. That was the day she changed her attitude towards him and they became friends again, until the day he proposed to her. Ignoring his calls now, Mia felt slightly guilty, but then pushed her guilt aside, deciding to explain to him why she didn't pick up later when she got home. Unknown to her that Owen was calling to let her know about the man who had escaped prison this morning. Neil, who was starting to feel restless about the route he was taking with Mia, decided to occupy his time productively by looking for a new route from the journey book prepared for him by Kai's brother. Perhaps he would find an easy route that would lead to the mountains from Mirage Mesa. Twisting around in his seat, Neil picked up his backpack and said, "I think I'll have a look at a map." Mia naturally assumed he wanted to check his phone map to see whatever town his new job was located in, but she was surprised to see him take out a sheet of paper. "Where exactly are you heading?" she asked curiously, while trying to peek at the paper in his hand, but he moved it away from her view. "Eldrame," he replied, sending her a brief look. "I interviewed for the job in Novaria, but I've never been to the company," he added so she wouldn't ask questions about the place he had only made up. He knew how she was like a curious kitten, and judging from how she was craning her neck to take a peek at his map, he could tell she still had that habit. "I don't think I've ever heard of Eldrame before," Mia murmured softly. And several minutes later, when he neatly refolded the map, Mia couldn't help but ask, "Did you find Eldrame in your map?" "No." To dissuade her from asking any further questions about the location of a non-existent town, he flashed the sheet of paper at her as he bent over the seat to put it back into his backpack. "I have detailed instructions right here, so I'll find it." She nodded, but her gaze was on the road exit up ahead. "The traffic jam is not going down. I think I'll get off the highway here and take a side road to get past the accident." "Good idea," Neil remarked. Mia drove off the main highway and drove onto a smaller road in the countryside. At first, the smaller road went the same direction as the main highway, but then it started to go in a different direction. "This might not have been a good idea after all," she remarked minutes later when the narrow blacktop road began to lead steadily further away from the main highway. Neil didn't immediately reply, because at the intersection up ahead, there was a deserted filling station, and at the edge of the empty lot near the road was an open phone booth for travelers. "I'd like to make a phone call if you wouldn't mind stopping. It won't take more than a couple of minutes." "Phone call? At the phone booth?" Mia was taken aback at the realization that he didn't have a phone and needed to use a public one. You can use my phone, she began to suggest for him to use hers, but he interrupted. "No, thank you, I prefer the phone booth," he said. Neil couldn't afford to take the risk of using even her phone, which he made the mental note to get rid of very soon. Mia didn't argue with him and pulled the car to a stop underneath the street lamp near the phone booth and watched him walk across the headlights' beams. Dusk had descended even earlier than usual, and the storm seemed to be outrunning them, dumping snow with surprising force. She increased her car warmer and decided to exchange her bulky long coat for her purple fashion-designed cardigan sweater that would be more comfortable while she drove. However, she needed to bring the sweater from her suitcase. But before she stepped out of the car, she tapped the screen of her car's infotainment system, selecting her favorite Entertainment Life podcast channel. With a simple command, her smartphone seamlessly connected to the car's Bluetooth, and the familiar voice of the podcast host filled the vehicle's interior. Mia smiled and increased the volume, then she got out of the car, walked around to the trunk, and opened it. With the trunk opened, she could hear the host discussing with her guest about the most talked-about celebrity of the year. And then she heard them talk about the interview she did with Aurora Quinn yesterday. Hearing them talk about her and about her engagement announcement with one of the most successful men in the country, Mia sighed and took off her coat. Then she pulled her purple cardigan sweater out of her suitcase. She had known this would be the most talked-about news in the media industry after Owen had made the announcement in the magazine without informing her. Mia wore her cardigan and walked back to the passenger seat of her car to take her phone to just call him, but then her gaze fell on the map that was sticking out of the backpack next to the seat. And her curiosity got the best of her. Furthermore, since she didn't know where the man she had given a ride was going and she wasn't entirely sure what route would lead to his destination or if she was taking him so far out of his way that he'd prefer to try to hitchhike with someone else, she decided to look at his weird map. Mia glanced at him in the phone booth, intending to hold up the map and ask his permission to look at it, but his shoulder was turned to her and he seemed to be so engrossed with the person he was speaking with on the phone to notice her. Deciding he couldn't possibly object, she unfolded the paper and opened the map he'd been studying. Spreading it across the seat, she held the ends down while the wind tried to whip them out of her hands. It took a full moment before she realized it wasn't a map to any town or city but to a place she had never been or thought about going. Puzzled, she glanced at the neatly written instructions written on the paper. As Mia read the instructions, her eyebrows frowned deeply as she realized he was heading to deserted mountains. The sheet contained the detailed route that would lead to his destination without being stopped by any checkpoints. Mia's lips parted in surprise. He was heading not for a job in some unknown town, but for a house in the north? In her car, the podcast host had just finished discussing the evening entertainment talk show and mentioned, "The most talked about news in the country today has caught everyone by surprise." Mia barely registered the woman's words, because she was staring at the tall man using the phone, and she felt again that strange, slithering unease, of shadowy familiarity. He had kept his shoulder turned to her, but he'd pulled down his face mask and removed his sunglasses and was holding them in his hand now. As if he sensed she was staring at him, he twisted his head toward her. His eyes narrowed on the open map in her hands at the same instant Mia had her first clear, brightly lit view of his face without the concealing sunglasses and face mask. The military reported that convicted murderer Neil Weiner escaped at approximately 1 p.m. this afternoon, announced the podcast host's voice. Mia was momentarily frozen, staring at the daring, rugged features of his face. And in that moment, she recognized him instantly.